So contemplating community, fostering connection through contemplative approaches to teaching and learning. I want to keep this really practical and quite experiential. There's also a lot of information that I'm going to try to give you as well, so that you've got a good overview of what contemplative pedagogy is, contemplative education, contemplative learning. It has many different names. But and before we go on, I'll say that I've also I've got a resource list. So I'm not going to go heavy on the research and the theory. I'll touch on a few things, but I've got a resource list that I can put in the chat after. And there's lots on there. So if you're looking, if you're interested in exploring any of this deeper, there's lots of good places to go. Let's start with a little practice. So just take a moment to settle in, whatever that means to you. And just notice that you have a body. Maybe feel the connection between your body and whatever you're sitting on. And notice your breathing. And then just take a moment to reflect on what does the word or the concept contemplation evoke for you. And as you're reflecting, see if you can also attend to the quality or the tone of the reflection. Is there an attitude of openness, curiosity? Is there a bit of aversion or skepticism? And just notice what that tone or quality of reflection, how that maybe shows up in your body or in your thoughts. Then you can let that go. And we'll get into the material. So this is divided into sort of three main components. What is contemplative pedagogy or contemplative education? How do you implement it skillfully in your teaching? And why? Why would we do this? And we're not going to spend a ton of time talking about the why, because we'll do a number of practices throughout the session. So I hope that you will come away with a sense of why we would maybe want to do this. So let's start with the what. So what is contemplative pedagogy? There isn't a standard definition like a lot of approaches to teaching and learning. It's often very context dependent. But here are a few definitions to give you a bit of a flavor. So this is from the Association for Contemplative Mind in Higher Education, which refers to contemplative pedagogy as a method of teaching that intentionally engages an awareness of and reflection on one's experiences, identities, thoughts, emotions, and values. This enables students to connect their learning to how they live their lives. There we go. From Columbia University, an approach to teaching and learning with the goal of encouraging deep learning through focused attention, reflection, and heightened awareness. And one more from the University of Arizona. Contemplative pedagogy involves the use of classroom practices that cultivate students' attention, emotion regulation, and engagement with material that promote personal insight and mindful dialogue. So this maybe gives you a little bit of a flavor. I will confess that when I read these definitions, it doesn't give me a strong sense of how contemplative pedagogy works. Something that's really helped me clarify my own approach to contemplative pedagogy is the notion of mindful learning that was developed by Ellen Langer. So Ellen Langer is a social psychologist at Harvard, and she's done all this fascinating work on what she calls mindfulness, but her conception of mindfulness is quite different from mindfulness associated with meditation or Buddhist traditions. So she talks about mindfulness as being the continuous creation of new categories, openness to new information, and implicit awareness of more than one perspective. And she contrasts that with mindlessness, which she says is characterized by an entrapment in old categories, by automatic behavior that precludes attending to new signals, and by action that operates from a single perspective. And I really like this way of thinking about sort of what this type of learning is and why we would engage it. You know, one of the reasons I became interested in contemplative pedagogy was noticing this quality of mindlessness in some of my students, um, and looking for ways to kind of enlarge and enrich the types of perspectives and just the relationship and orientation to information and experience that my students brought to the classroom. It's also helpful to consider what contemplative pedagogy is not, or not necessarily. So a common comment I hear when talking about contemplative pedagogy or contemplative learning is, well, isn't that just reflection? So often I hear, okay, contemplative pedagogy, isn't that just reflection? Reflection is absolutely a part of contemplative pedagogy, but there are a couple of other components that I think distinguishes contemplative pedagogy from what we might consider more of just sort of like a straight up reflection. One is the deliberate evocation of meta-awareness. So in that opening practice, I asked you to reflect on what contemplative means to you. What does that concept or idea mean to you? We could have stopped there, but in a contemplative frame, we want to sort of invite a little bit more reflection around who is reflecting. What is the quality or the tone of the reflection? How does what is, so the contents of my mind, the cognitions, how are those showing up also in my body, maybe in my emotions, maybe in my social interactions? So contemplative pedagogy, I think, is a little distinct from reflection in that there's this quality of meta-awareness that we attempt to cultivate. The other thing that is a little bit different with contemplative pedagogy is that in many exercises, we actually invite participants to suspend reflection. So an example would be, if anyone's familiar with very traditional mindfulness meditation, where you're sitting in stillness, thoughts are coming into your mind, but what we're trying to do is not engage too much with those. We're trying to sort of not engage with the contents of what's going on in our mind. Instead, we're just trying to sort of sit back and let whatever comes into our mind go in and out. And we'll do an exercise in a few minutes that will explore how this works in a contemplative reading exercise. Another thing that contemplative pedagogy is not necessarily, so this is another thing I hear often when we talk about contemplative pedagogy is, oh, well, that's just meditation or mindfulness in the classroom. And contemplative pedagogy absolutely can include meditation or mindfulness, but it doesn't necessarily include meditation or mindfulness. So that's important because meditation is not up everyone's alley. So you can be interested in contemplative pedagogy and not necessarily be interested in mindfulness or meditation. Contemplative pedagogy isn't linked to a belief or a set of beliefs. So yeah, not much more needs to be said about that. But there's often criticisms of the approach that it's bringing religion into the classroom. And that's not the case, as I hope you'll see from this session today. It's not New Age. It's not a stress relief or relaxation strategy. So sometimes people find that contemplative approaches, contemplative practices or exercises can be calming. I even noticed that opening little reflection, just leading that calmed me down. And that can often be an effect of a contemplative practice, but it's not necessarily the aim within a classroom situation, depending on your discipline or the reason that you might be using contemplative pedagogy. So it's not necessarily for stress relief or relaxation. That's also not necessarily slow or quiet or serious. Um, the exercises we'll be doing today will be kind of slow, quiet, and serious, but um, contemplative practices can also be quite dynamic. They can be quite playful. They can be quite active. So not necessarily serious. Does anybody have any questions about any of this before I go on? I will keep going. So this is an image from the Association for Contemplative Mind in Society, which is kind of the parent organization for the Association for Contemplative Mind in Higher Education. And they have produced this image of a tree which shows all different kinds of contemplative practices in many, many different domains. So we see contemplative practices in movement domains, creative, stillness, generative, and then these branch off into all different kinds of practices. So what you might use in your own teaching has a lot to do with what you perceive that your students need or may respond to, what your discipline is. So in my case, I actually use quite a lot of movement-based contemplative practices in my teaching. Because that actually seems to work very well in my discipline. I'm in music. And it'll also depend a lot on what you're interested in, what you're drawn to. I like to break this down even further to into different modes of practice. So I think of sort of two types of practices that I might incorporate into my teaching. One I call a glimpse practice. This is a term I got from a meditation teacher named Diana Winston, who's based at UCLA. And a glimpse practice is just sort of a touch and go. There's not necessarily a lot of setup, and you don't stay there very long. It's quick, usually 2 minutes or less. And the intention is just quickly open up or shift your participants' perception and awareness. So let's do a very quick little glimpse practice right now. If you want to just settle back into your seat, and then just begin to let your eyes travel around your space and notice the objects in your space and see if it's possible to catch that moment before you label the object or start telling a story about it. And you may find that it's not possible to do that, and that's just interesting to note. You might play with your gaze. Is it wide or is it narrow? Just noticing if there's a little moment, even a split second, of just pure perception before the labeling kicks in. And you can let that go. And the other type of practice that sort of the category of practice that I use is what I would call a long form practice. And a long form practice I think of as being a little bit more structured. So there's a clear beginning, middle, and an end. So a little bit more setup, a little bit more meat in the middle, and then a little bit more, a little bit of a smoother exit. It doesn't have to be super long though. Could be anywhere from 5 or 10 minutes, or it could last an entire class session. And I think about these sorts of practices as opportunities to deepen contemplative awareness and students' relationship to the material, maybe also their relationship to each other. So let's do a little bit of a longer practice. So before we do the practice, just take a moment to settle, whatever that means to you. So if it would feel good to move or stretch, you can absolutely do that for a moment, because I will give the instructions and then we'll go into the practice. So if you want to move while I'm doing that, that would be just fine. So I'm going to read a brief passage from an essay by Wendell Berry called Damage. And while I read the passage, I want to see if it's possible for you to rest in an attitude of not knowing and not deciding. So see if it is possible to listen to the passage without trying to figure out what the passage is about, or to try to assess its relevance or decide whether or not you like it. Just see if it's possible to let the words make contact with your awareness. Let any images or sensations that arise come and go as they will. If you notice that you are analyzing, or if preferences are kicking in, that's pretty common. It's to be expected. But see if it's possible to settle back into a more receptive attitude. So notice that that's happening, and then just settle back into a more receptive attitude. Okay, so let's do it. So if you've been moving, then just come into a comfortable seat. You can decide if you'd like your eyes open or closed, whatever feels comfortable for you. And I will read this opening from this essay called Damage. I have a steep wooded hillside that I wanted to be able to pasture occasionally, but it had no permanent water supply. About halfway to the top of the slope, there is a narrow bench on which I thought I could make a small pond. I hired a man with a bulldozer to dig one. He cleared away the trees and then formed the pond, cutting into the hill on the upper side, piling the loosened dirt in a curving earthwork on the lower. The pond appeared to be a success. Before the bulldozer quit work, water had already begun to seep in. Soon there was enough to support a few head of stock. To heal the exposed ground, I fertilized it and sowed it with grass and clover. We had an extremely wet fall and winter, with the usual freezing and thawing. The ground grew heavy with water and soft. The earthwork slumped. A large slice of the woods floor on the upper side slipped down into the pond. The trouble was the familiar one: too much power, too little knowledge. The fault was mine. I was careful to get expert advice, but this only exemplifies what I already knew. No expert knows everything about every place, not even everything about any place. If one's knowledge of one's whereabouts is insufficient, if one's judgment is unsound, then expert advice is of little use. So take a moment and notice what that was like. Just reflect for a moment what that was like. It's not that common to be read aloud to. So notice what that was like. And just observe if there are any particular images or ideas, thoughts that come into your mind in response to that. And if anyone wants to share, we're very small here, but if anyone has any observations that they want to share, we can just pause for a moment. Let's keep moving.
I can share, Karen. Sorry, may I?
Sure, yeah.
And I don't know what it means, and I think maybe part of what I need to understand here is that I don't need to know what it means. I think that's perhaps I'm realizing that is that I focused in my mind's eye, I focused on the shape of a bowl in the shape of this pond being created with this with the earth being moved from the uphill slope to the downhill slope, and that was what was in my mind's eye, and that's what I saw.
Yeah. Yeah, there's no outcome anticipated, other than to just sort of play with this idea or this experience, or maybe even experiment would be a better word, of can we sort of be in a space of not knowing, not deciding. So very similar to the glimpse practice, but a little bit more structured. And again, this is what I was talking about earlier with the idea that often in a contemplative mode of instruction, we would ask people to suspend or pause reflection or analysis, and instead just to try to be in a slightly more receptive frame of mind. Let's go on to the how. How to skillfully integrate contemplative approaches. So I've got this divided into three different phases. The first is before. Gavin says, quick observation, pausing, analysis, a hard thing to do. Yeah, absolutely. That's a pretty common observation. We don't get a lot of we get a lot of reinforcement in our culture for being very quick to analyze and decide and to sift through information and figure out what to do with it. And we don't give as much attention to the value that there might be in not deciding. So skillfully integrating contemplative approaches. So before doing so, I think this is vital. Your own practice is really, really important. Does this mean you have to go on a year-long meditation retreat? No, it does not. But I think having some sort of facility and personal experience with contemplative practice, whatever that might look like to you, is really, really important before you start bringing this to others. So in my own case, I meditated for many years, and I actually did quite a bit of training in meditation facilitation. And I did actually do a little bit of retreat practice. You don't really have to go that far, but I do think having some facility with this in terms of your own practice is important. As with all good teaching practice, it's important to get to know your students and to teach the humans in front of you. And many aspects of what you know about your students will inform your approach. So, you know, what type of program they're in, what stage of their program are they in. In my case, I mostly teach upper year undergraduate and graduate courses. They're usually fairly small. And because I'm in a small program, my students know each other. And that can be a plus and a minus when you're asking students to engage in these types of practices. But knowing your students is important. Start small. So my suggestion would be maybe try one or two contemplative exercises over the course of a term and see how students respond. This is really, really important, and I think what distinguishes contemplative pedagogy from doing a meditation or relaxation exercise in the class is that contemplative approaches have a clear purpose that is linked to the course material or the learning outcomes. So it's really important to consider what is it that you want your students to get out of this or to explore. It doesn't always have to be tied to an outcome of the practice itself, but what do you want your students to explore, and why is that important in the larger context of the class, that individual class session or the course? During the practice, I've got this in parentheses because I think this is interesting to consider. So I think it can be important to be transparent about your purpose and intentions for introducing these types of practices in the classroom. And at the same time, it can also be interesting to drop a practice in that's maybe a little bit disruptive to students' normal way of thinking and processing without a lot of setup. And if we're too transparent about our purpose and intentions, it can lead to a dynamic where students um, are sort of stressed out and fretting about, if they did it right, or is that what was supposed to happen? And so um, I think some transparency is really important, and I think we can be kind of soft with that, so that we're not, or at least alert to the possibility that if we're too prescriptive, we can we can actually shut down the sort of open exploration that we want our students to engage in. Um, Providing options is important. So typically in my classes, I make everything, any sort of exercise or activity that we engage in, optional. No one is required to do it. And then within the exercises themselves, it's you can often provide many options, like eyes open, eyes closed. Um, for many people, being still is actually really difficult. So if you want to be moving, that's okay. If you prefer to be standing, that's okay. I try not to specify like how I want people to be sitting or positioned. So just inviting people to come into a posture that's comfortable for them. So options are important. I think it's helpful to think in terms of structured improvisation. So I got this notion from a book by Daniel Barbazat and Mirabai Bush about contemplative practices in higher education. And they talk about contemplative practices as structured improvisation. So it's good to have a plan, but it's also good to be able to feel what's happening in the moment and respond. It can be helpful to have a little bit of a debrief afterwards to ask how people responded to a certain exercise. And then normalize diverse responses. So again, we want to me, one of the main purposes of integrating contemplative approaches is to create a bit of a space in the room, in the community of the classroom, but also within the students themselves, where it's okay to not know, where we can hold multiple viewpoints simultaneously and not feel as though we have to decide, not feel pressured to decide. Um, and so it can be really helpful to do a little bit of debrief to see how your students responded to the exercises. It gives you important information, but then also to normalize that people are going to respond really differently to different exercises. After, uh, it's really, I think, just good practice to determine appropriate methods for assessing the effectiveness of contemplative practices and exercises. Um, some people actually assess practices themselves. I tend not to. But I want to be really clear on what it is that I'm looking to see in my students in response to doing these practices. So am I looking for a certain depth of engagement with material and ideas in their work that they produce for the class? Sometimes their experience with these practices and whether or not they're effective, or at least um, giving students what you're hoping they'll give them. That will come out if there's a journal component to a class, you may see it there. Um, I will often see it in course evaluations, and particularly midterm check-ins. I like to do midterm evaluations, and so I will quite often see um, I get a sense there of whether or not these practices are effective. What's effective? What do they like? What do they not like? Um, those sorts of things. So I just want to pause and see if there are any questions. And if not, that was my book. If not, we're going to do another little exercise.
Hi, Karen. I do have a question.
Mm-hmm.
It's
Morning,
Jana.
Jana.
I love what you're doing. Keep it up. If you would prefer to answer the question later on, but I'm wondering what have you noticed differences if you've been teaching remotely versus in person when you're, presenting contemplative approaches?
That's a great question. The biggest difference that I find is that I have a little bit less um, access to, when you engage in a contemplative exercise with a group of people, there's often a bit of a vibe that comes over the room. You can feel, yeah, so you're a versed practitioner, so you can kind of feel a shift in the environment when um, people are starting to sort of enter the kind of territory that you want them to enter, and that's much less easy to assess in um, an online environment because it's really embodied. So you being in the room with the people in and sort of picking up the vibes. I know I said it wasn't new age, but there you go. I do find that more challenging. Otherwise, I actually find there have been some real benefits to being online, doing these sorts of practices. One thing I think that gives students quite a bit of a feeling of safety and comfort in engaging in these practices is being able to turn off their video and kind of make themselves comfortable in whatever way and not being worried that people are looking at them. They can kind of go into their own little bubble, which I think can be very helpful. And I've also found students are often, they've been, in some cases, not always, but some cases, more free with sharing their observations, or I've had more diverse observations kind of come to the surface through the chat than sometimes happens in a class situation. But for the most part, I find these practices look, or they work quite well, even in an online context.
Great, thank you for that.
Okay, we're going to do another little practice, and then we're going to do a little mini, a quick little breakout room. So here is, oh, I did want to, I've got in my notes here this caveat, which is that I'm not following all these rules for skillful integration today. In my actual classes, I tend to take a little bit less of a quick and dirty approach, and wouldn't do a series of practices likely in one class setting. But I did want to give you a little bit of a sense of the different ways that this could look in a class setting. So this is a little bit more than we would often do in a class. So I am going to put a passage up on the next slide, and spoiler alert, it's the same passage that I read a moment ago. And this is going to be a little bit more of a straight up mindful reading exercise. So I'm going to give you a few moments, maybe 2 or 3 minutes, and I'll ask you to read the passage and see if you can keep your attention with the text as you read. So notice, once again, any tendency for the mind to wander, and see if you can bring your attention back to the text when that happens. Similarly, notice any tendency to analyze or interpret, or if any preferences get activated. And if that happens, which it probably will, it's not a problem. You are not doing it wrong. It's not an issue. It's more about having the intention to stay with the text, noticing when your attention gets pulled away, and then see if it's back to kind of, if it's possible to go back to kind of settling into a bit more of a receptive mode, if that makes sense. So I will go on to the next slide. And we'll just take a moment to read this. And if you get to the end, go back to the beginning. And I'm curious about if there are any responses to that exercise. You can just unmute and speak, or you can put them in the chat if you want, whatever works for you. But what was it easy or hard to keep your mind with the text? No takers. Okay, well, we're going to go into breakout rooms for just a few minutes. And in the breakout room, I want you to think about, so Michael, are you there? You're going to
I'm
set
here.
this up? Okay. In the breakout room, I'm going to put you into groups of two. And just what I'd like you to share with your partner, and this will be quick, will be for 2 or 3 minutes. Share with your partner anything that you noticed about your mind. Was there anything surprising about that came up in either of this exercise, any of the little exercises that we've done there? Did you notice anything about your perception or your awareness, your thought patterns that you had not been previously aware of anything that was interesting or surprising to you? You can report that to your partner. So you're going to get an invitation. Oh, all right. Thanks, Andrea. It's better that you tell us now than somebody gets to the breakout room and doesn't have a partner. So yeah, so you'll get an invitation to the breakout room, and we'll just be there for 2 or 3 minutes. All right, I'm going to assume this is everyone. Any observations about the any of the exercises or the dialogue with your partner? Is there anything surprising or interesting or noteworthy that came up? Did anyone notice anything? So I asked you to share with your partner if anything was surprising in what you noticed about. So again, this is that meta awareness. Did you notice anything about the way your mind works in any of these exercises that was interesting or surprising or noteworthy? You can unmute or write it in the chat if you want to share.
So Karen, in our little pair, it's just like you say, like paying attention to attention. I mean, how often do we do that? We're just kind of so busy doing one thing to the next. And even for someone like me who kind of knows where this is coming from, to step back into that and go, oh, am I doing it right? Like, is this what you wanted me to do? And oh, wait, so having to kind of grapple with my own, what my natural tendencies might be. Is it like an interesting and valuable break? It's a step back from what we tend to do on autopilot.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting for a lot of us, that kind of gold star mind can kick in really quickly. Yeah. Any other observations?
I have always noticed that, and maybe it's a cultural thing, I don't know, that we're really, there's I guess maybe it's even a teaching trope that there's uncomfortable silences, that we talk about that. I even talked about it this morning, right? That there's always got to be noise, someone's always got to be talking, there's always analysis. And I guess what struck me was the encouragement to not sort of be in that constant dialogue, to be okay with silence, but then also in, like, if I understand correctly, I also have to push myself not to name things, label things, read things out loud inside my head. And I just think that's an interesting place to push us, because it's so atypical from how we've been taught to think. Maybe back to that gold star mindset that we have, Karen.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting, it's not that sort of labeling and deciding, and those aren't it's not that there's anything wrong with that, but I just think when we have the awareness that is where our brain tends to go to, it often provides just a little bit of space or a little bit of perspective where we can consider that there might be a value in not going to that place right away.
Well, the last thing I'll just say is that, well,
Sure.
if I understand that part of this is being aware of the limits of one's own knowledge, in the sense that you can be open to other ways of knowing or ways of thinking or ways of doing. And I guess this is, I see it as a intentional way to make that explicit. So yeah, interesting for me to think about.
Yeah, thanks. Any other observations or thoughts on that?
Hi, Karen. I will share with you that when you read this passage to me, it was a very
Yeah,
different experience from what me reading it myself.
yeah.
I'm a very visual person, and when you were reading, I closed my eyes and I just let pictures go through my mind. And I pictured a wooded hillside, a round pond, the hillside falling into the pond, and I just uh, images flowed with the story. But when I was reading it, I was very much more aware of the text on the screen, the black and white. It wasn't as vibrant for me,
Mhm.
and I didn't create those same pictures. But there was an emotional element that happened in the middle of both of those experiences. That's when the hillside fell into the pond. I for a second I had this like a sense of disappointment.
Interesting. Yeah, that's so interesting. I think the reading aloud can be fascinating, and something I've often done with students is divided it up. So different students read little sections, and that's such an interesting hearing people's different tones of voice, and um, everybody reads at a slightly different pace and with slightly different intonation can often provide an interesting element as well. Maybe it's because I'm a musician that I like that. Um, so I just want to wrap this up and talk a little bit about why we would do this. And again, I don't want to I don't want to I want to be light on this because I think it really is experiential, and it really unfolds really differently. The benefits of this type of activity are quite varied. And so I think it's really important to honor that. But um, some reasons. So this openness to diverse perspectives. And we didn't explore practices today that were explicitly aimed at that, but that is definitely something. Even just that practice, that one where I read it to you and I asked you to just try not to decide. That can be a really valuable practice, to just be open to more than one perspective. I think that this cultivation of meta awareness is actually a superpower. That the more aware we can be of the fact that there are all these sensations and mental habits and emotional habits that are driving our behavior um, all the time, and we're just not aware of it. When we start to be a little bit more aware, um, that gives us a little bit of room to maneuver and to respond differently, whether that's in our relational lives or even in our academic lives. Um, Lots of contemplative practices develop intentional stability and or flexibility. So the one that we just did, the reading, and I asked you to try to keep your mind with the text. So this is looking at attentional stability, and you would need to do a lot of that type of practice to see sort of a noticeable difference in attentional stability, but that's a pretty valuable skill. And then flexibility is also really important, is being able to attend to something and then fluidly move it with intention to something else and not kind of be yanked around. Can be really valuable. I think all this can lead to a deeper engagement with the material. And then the theme of the whole conference, compassion and connection. I feel, again, there's lots of contemplative exercises that explicitly um, cultivate compassion and connection. I don't tend to use those a lot in the classroom. Sometimes I do. But what I do find is that this um, sort of being together in this space, in this more receptive awareness, is really, really nourishing. And when we become aware of our own sort of habitual thought habits and reactions and our natural tendency to sort of judge or categorize, and then when we sort of do some sharing, whether that's in a full class debrief or a small group or partner work where we describe what we're noticing about our mental habits, this natural empathy tends to arise in response to that. So my experience has been that doing these kinds of practices just adds an element of humanity and just a different way of working with our minds and working with our awareness that very, very naturally builds a sense of community and connection and belonging in classes. So I am going to leave it there, mindful of the fact that we're almost out of time. And I'm going to stop sharing and ask if anybody has any questions or any other observations. And if not, that is okay. I do have, I did prepare a list of resources that I thought might be helpful if you're interested in exploring this further. So that it's a combination of books and scholarly articles, some explicitly dealing with higher education contexts, some dealing with more, just life contexts that I found really helpful. And I'm also happy, I'm happy to share my email address here in the chat. And so it's not a surprising email address, kbulmer@mun.ca. If anybody wants to just email me, I'm happy to also send that to you as well.